You know how Pokemon Sword and Shield have a pretty obvious theme of renewal? I've talked about it recently. Turns out, it doesn't just apply to the characters and the plot. You can also see it in the style of the Pokemon designs. If you look at the overall aesthetic of Generation 1, and you compare it to just the most recent generation, Generation 7, you'll notice that modern Pokemon designs have a lot more detail. They have a lot of little elements that would have been hard to represent in a 56-pixel box. And they also have a lot more colors, also something that would have been difficult to get across when you're working in grayscale pixel art. Strangely, Generation 8 seems to have a lot of Pokemon that are more on the Gen 1 side of that scale. A lot of Pokemon with simpler designs, or with just one main color. A lot of them are concentrated on the early roots, like Nickit, Eldegoss, Wooloo, Boltund, but it does also apply to some later Pokemon as well. The Roly-Poly family has a pretty strong Gen 1 vibe. Colossal, in particular, really rocking that Gen 1 kaiju look, even in the eye design. The Hatterene family is also pretty simple and relatively single-tone. Pincurchin, Snom, even Duraludon I feel would be pretty at home in Gen 1. Rookidee and Corvisquire I feel are a little bit more advanced on that Gen 1 to Gen 7 scale, but Corviknight I think is pretty far on the Gen 1 side of it. The starters, I think, are a pretty interesting case here because all three of the first stages look more like modern Pokemon designs than the earlier starters. Their designs are all complex enough that we as a community were able to figure out pretty early on what their themes were supposed to be, but as they evolve, they don't really get more complex. Compare Grookey to Rowlet and Rillaboom to Decidueye. Grookey and Rowlet are more or less equivalent in the complexity of their designs, but Rillaboom has very little detail compared to Decidueye. It's more on the level of something like a Meganium. Feel like it's even less detailed than Venusaur. I do think that all three of the final stage starters are pretty successful. They all have their personalities, which are related to but also distinct from that of their original stages. All of the designs are strong individually, especially I think the Sobble line in the way that it shows growth but also sticks to that theme of blending in really well. But I also think that they are a very weak set of starters. They are very homogeneous. All three are very humanoid, and a gorilla is going to be humanoid no matter what, but I feel like Cinderace is more a soccer player than a rabbit, and Inteleon is more a spy than a chameleon. Cinderace and Inteleon also have pretty obvious clothing as part of their designs, and full disclosure, I don't like Pokemon that look like they are wearing clothes. Inteleon's does pass a little bit more for patterning than Cinderace that actually looks like it's wearing something. But even Inteleon's is still a very obvious suit, and the only other time that we've had three final stage starters that were even just bipedal was Generation 6, with Delphox, Chestnut, and Greninja.
Only your favorite of the three.
Only my favorite of the three. But those retained more of their animalistic characteristics, I thought. They were less humanoid, and every other set of starters has had at least one Pokemon that was not bipedal. So Generation 8 is really lacking in diversity. The first stage starter Pokemon, of course, aren't the only complex designs. There's the Blipbug family. Orbeetle in particular has a lot of different elements, brings a lot of things together, and actually does it in a really successful way. Sizzlipede and Centiskorch, same thing. There's also Toxel and Toxtricity. Toxtricity being, I think, one of the most successful designs of the generation. And of course, most designs fall somewhere in the middle of that Gen 1 to Gen 7 scale, but the proportion of high-end, high-complexity designs feels really low. The skew is really strong towards the Gen 1 side. Interestingly though, I think that all Galarian forms and Galarian evolutions are consistently higher on that scale. Galarian forms, and especially the Galarian evolutions, fit really well with modern Pokemon designs. They still look recognizably like their original forms, but with that added layer of complexity, or more than one layer even. Mr. Rhyme, as much as I hate it, seems to have a lot of different layers, and Obstagoon and Runerigus and Stunfisk are all fantastic designs. These Galarian Pokemon are one of the best things about the generation. And I think some of the best things about these games. If you go back to that comparison between Generation 1 and Generation 7 designs, there's another trend you might notice. Generation 1 designs were a lot more realistic. They were more animalistic, more monstrous. Whereas Generation 7, they were much more cartoon animal, cartoon monster. They had more exaggerated features, their proportions weren't as realistic. And in this regard, Generation 8 actually does stick more to the Gen 7 side of the scale rather than Gen 1, and even goes a step further with some of those designs. But the thing is that when you combine that with that sort of simplicity of designs from Generation 1, we end up with some designs that are so cartoony they almost don't really feel like Pokemon anymore. Greedent is one that everyone seems to agree on. There's something about its expression that is just too exaggerated. There's also Eiscue and Stonjourner, which I feel like are interesting ideas, but with just way too much cartooniness thrown into that recipe. There's Morpeko, Cramorant, Phalanx, all good designs, but with their gimmicks just being a little too cartoony. Mostly I don't really mind it, but Phalanx is one that I don't like. It reminds me way too much of a Wiggler from Mario, and not even so much in the way that it looks, although that too, but more so in the way that it moves. It inhabits the overworld more like a Mario enemy, like something you should avoid rather than something you want to seek out. And then in other situations like camp, it just doesn't move naturally. I kind of like the idea, but the execution, especially in terms of its animations and programming, is very weak. To finish off, I just wanted to touch on the legendary Pokemon. The hero of many battles forms of Zacian and Zamazenta look like pretty standard Pokemon, maybe a little bit awkward, especially Zamazenta with its weirdly thick neck, but the ground forms look really good. And here I do prefer Zamazenta. I think the shield mane looks more natural, but both of them do look really good. They look royal, they look legendary, especially with that glow that you see in some cutscenes. Really, you can tell that these Pokemon are something special. And Eternatus, it hardly looks like a Pokemon at all, but it's more like an Ultra Beast or like a Necrozma kind of thing. It's an ancient alien life form, so the fact that it doesn't really look like a modern Pokemon is probably a good thing. The Eternamax form I do think takes it a little too far. It feels more like battling like Master Hand in Super Smash Bros. Than battling against a Pokemon, but I feel like that was probably part of the point. I know many of you had been hoping that I would just go ahead and make the best and worst designs of Generation 8 videos like right away, but it's not really the time for that yet. If I make those videos too soon after the release of the games, it ends up being way too subjective. That series of videos is actually based on some posts that I made on a personal website just after the release of Generation 6, and by the time I was converting those posts into the videos and making updates, I noticed that the Gen 6 selections were pretty much completely wrong. So I want to give it some more time so I can have a little bit more objective analysis, even though this is Pokemon Designs and it's going to be subjective anyway. All right, what are the things I need to say? If you enjoyed this video,
subscribe if you're new. Hit that like button, ring that bell for a notification. You can follow me on Twitter, my wife on Instagram.
Too many calls to action.
Contribute to Patreon.
If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and let me know in the comments what you agree and disagree with, which ones were your favorite designs of Generation 8, which ones were your least favorite. And of course, I have to say a very special thank you to this month's luxury patron, Ethan Saffron. I'm Umbreon Libris. I'll see you in the next chapter.